My name is Dr. Nathan Hale. I've been an astrophysicist at NASA for 15 years. If you're reading this, it means the worst has already happened. Either I'm dead, or they've already arrived. Either way, it's too late for me, but not for you. This account is my last attempt to warn humanity, even knowing that many will dismiss my words as the ramblings of a paranoid man. I want you to know, everything I'm about to share is true. I'm writing this hidden in a small supply closet, using a cell phone connected to an obsolete satellite network that I secretly reactivated. I don't know how much time I have before I'm found. They're coming, and it will probably be before Christmas. My life used to be routine, at least by the standards of someone working at NASA. My days were filled with complex calculations, astronomical data analysis, endless meetings, and that nerdy enthusiasm that always motivated me. Since childhood, science had been my guide, my light in an infinite universe of mysteries. But it was during one of these seemingly monotonous routines that my reality fell apart. We were working on a routine space monitoring project. Nothing too exciting, analyzing noises and signals coming from the depths of space, trying to separate natural phenomena from interference caused by our own satellites. It was the kind of work that used to calm me. No surprises, just the cold beauty of math and physics. Until that day. It was a morning like any other. I was in the lab with a lukewarm cup of coffee on the table, adjusting the frequencies of a particularly weak signal picked up by our instruments. Protocol required us to rule out local interference before archiving the signal as inconclusive, but something about this one caught my attention. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but there was a pattern. It wasn't a pulsar, nor terrestrial radio interference. When I enhanced the data and put it into a spectrogram, a chill ran down my spine. The signal had a structure, not just a common rhythmic repetition, but something organized. I spent hours analyzing it, skipping lunch and ignoring calls from colleagues who wanted to discuss another project. With every new manipulation of the data, the pattern became more evident. It wasn't natural, and more importantly, it didn't seem accidental. I sent the signal to a colleague in the data processing department and asked for his opinion. Probably atmospheric interference, he replied casually. Another colleague suggested it was just background noise from the universe. Even with all the evidence I presented, no one seemed to take it seriously. That was when my initial enthusiasm gave way to unease. I knew I had stumbled onto something big, something no one was willing to confront. There was something about that pattern that was unlike anything we had ever seen. I decided to investigate on my own, even if it meant bypassing protocols. At night, with the building empty and silent, I accessed the raw signal data directly from the main server. I worked until nearly dawn. As I filtered out the interference and refined the spectrum, an absurd but inevitable idea began to take shape in my mind. This signal was a message. And it wasn't a friendly one. The next day, I tried once again to speak with one of the directors. I explained my discovery calmly, showed the data, and even suggested bringing the matter to a larger group of specialists. But I was met with skeptical looks and a response that still echoes in my head. Dr. Hale, let it go. We already have enough problems to deal with speculation. Focus on your work. That was the moment I realized I was alone. Even so, I couldn't stop. In the following nights, I dug deeper. I found additional patterns, fragments of something more complex than I could understand. Using tools I had secretly developed, I began to decode small sections of the message. It was a sequence of stellar coordinates, followed by what appeared to be a timeline. The timeline pointed to a date, December 24th. In the weeks that followed, I became more cautious. I had the feeling I was being watched, as if my sudden interest in that signal had drawn unwanted attention. My access passwords were reset without explanation, my computer was reassigned to another department, and I was instructed to focus on less significant projects. You need a vacation, Nathan, they said. But I knew this was a warning disguised as kindness. I decided to take the data outside NASA. I loaded the files onto an encrypted flash drive and secretly shared them with an old friend, now a professor at a private university. He was someone I could trust, but when I tried calling him days later, his wife answered. "He's away at a conference. He didn't leave a contact number," was all she said. I never heard from him again. Now here I am, hiding, unsure if I'll have time to finish this account. But there's something you need to understand. The message I found wasn't just a warning. It was an announcement. They're coming, and you need to be prepared. The silence of the lab at night was almost absolute, broken only by the faint hum of the servers in the background. It was this silence that allowed me to think clearly, even though lately my mind felt like a tangle of doubts, theories, and fears. If what I had discovered was true, it didn't make sense that no one had noticed before. Something like this doesn't just come out of nowhere. That's when I decided to look where no one else was looking. NASA has an immense database, full of information collected over decades. Not everything is accessible to every employee, even for someone with my credentials. Still, I knew there was a way to access old, protected files, but it involved crossing several ethical and security boundaries. At that moment, ethics were the last thing on my mind. I needed answers. The following night, using a loophole in the authentication system that I had discovered years earlier during a security project, I began searching encrypted records. I didn't expect to find anything relevant right away, but I was wrong. The first clue appeared in a 1998 report. It was a brief, almost insignificant document about the detection of an unusual radio signal picked up by probes near Jupiter. The description was vague, but the numbers were unmistakable. The signal's pattern was eerily similar to the one I had found weeks earlier. I kept diving deeper, descending into a kind of digital labyrinth. Similar reports appeared at decade-long intervals, all buried under layers of secrecy. The more I read, the faster my heart raced. These signals weren't new. They had been detected for a long time, but were always classified as anomalies and filed away in security levels accessible to few. Then I came across something that sent a chill down my spine. A series of images taken by probes in the 1970s. They weren't clear, but they showed a strange object orbiting Jupiter. It was massive, far larger than any satellite or station built by humans. The records were concise, but the last note was alarming. The object has maintained a stable orbit since 1972. Anomalous interference detected in measurement instruments. I remembered something I'd heard years ago, a rumor among scientists that space missions were never just about exploration, but also about monitoring. At the time, I found it funny, a silly conspiracy theory. Now, I wasn't so sure. I presented my discoveries to a superior the next day. I brought my findings to a superior the next day, a man named Dr. Robert Klein. He was the kind who rarely showed emotion, but as I spoke, I noticed a faint tremor in his hands. When I finished, he sat silently for a moment before leaning back in his chair. "Nathan, you're a good scientist, but you need to know when to stop. This information, it's not for you. It's best to leave it where you found it." His response was a mix of warning and veiled threat. I should have let it go. Any rational person would have. But something about his reaction convinced me I was right. He knew. They all knew. What I didn't realize was that, in seeking answers, I was drawing the wrong kind of attention to myself. After weeks of paranoia and sleepless nights, my hands finally trembled for a different reason. Not from fear, but from a morbid excitement. I had stumbled upon something that shouldn't exist. Obscure references to an unnamed facility hidden in the Nevada desert, specifically within Area 51. These references appeared only in fragments of old emails and encrypted reports. The notes weren't explicit, but they were enough to set my mind racing. Extraterrestrial artifacts, item alpha, and dates that matched the signals I had been studying. Why would an alien object be connected to a radio pattern we only detected decades later? None of it made sense, but the questions were irresistible. I knew hacking NASA's system had been a tremendous risk, but I was trapped in a dilemma. Either uncover more or lose my sanity with the little I already knew. The problem was figuring out how to get to the Nevada desert without raising suspicion. Luckily, my time at NASA had given me something even encrypted files couldn't provide: connections. Taking a bold step, I used my status as a respected scientist to suggest I was interested in security training, standard for employees seeking promotions or special assignments. Initially, my request was met with skepticism, but surprisingly, it was approved faster than I had expected. Within days, I received a formal invitation to visit a remote facility. The location wasn't specified in the invite, but I had a feeling I was being taken straight to the heart of the mystery. When the plane landed on an isolated airstrip flanked by dry mountains and reddish dust, my suspicion was confirmed. The Nevada desert was emptier and more desolate than I had imagined. We were greeted by men in dark suits, their expressions as unreadable as the weapons discreetly holstered at their sides. "Dr. Hale, please follow us." They placed me in a windowless jeep, and the drive that followed was a maze of dirt roads. With no cell signal or landmarks, it was impossible to tell where we were going. The only constant was the oppressive silence. When we arrived, I found myself before an underground facility that looked like something out of a sci-fi movie. The place was vast, with reinforced gates and guards at every corner. The air felt heavy, as if the very atmosphere carried the weight of the secrets buried in that desert. I was led through endless corridors to a small auditorium, where I received a standard briefing about security protocol in critical zones. It was a flimsy excuse, but I knew something bigger was in store for me. As I anticipated, they called me for a special tour. The corridors became colder and narrower as we descended in an elevator that seemed to go on forever. When the doors finally opened, I was greeted by a massive, brilliantly lit laboratory filled with equipment I had never seen before, not even in NASA's most advanced facilities. And that's when I saw it for the first time. The item Alpha. The creature was contained in a transparent capsule surrounded by tubes and wires. Its body was slender, with a metallic-looking skin that subtly reflected the light. Its large, black eyes appeared lifeless, yet its presence was deeply unsettling. Even in apparent hibernation, it was impossible not to sense the incomprehensible intelligence emanating from it. A scientist standing beside me spoke without emotion. "This is Item Alpha, captured in 1987 during an incursion into Earth's atmosphere. It was in a small craft that crashed in Siberia. The Soviet government covered up the incident and handed the specimen over to the Americans in exchange for economic benefits at the end of the Cold War." I could barely breathe. "Why doesn't anyone know about this?" I whispered. "Because it's not something people should know, Dr. Hale." He led me to a table where documents were laid out. They included detailed maps of Earth, annotated in a language our top linguists had yet to fully translate. There were images of major cities, New York, Tokyo, and records showing humanity's development in a way no external civilization should have had access to. It carried this? Yes. It seems they've been studying humanity for centuries, perhaps millennia. My mind raced with questions. Why were they studying us? What did they want? And most importantly, why now? Sensing my unease, the scientist added, "We don't know their objectives, but one thing has become clear over time. This is not a peaceful exploration." At that moment, everything clicked. The signals, the object orbiting Jupiter, and now this. They weren't just observing, they were planning. The lifeless gaze of the being in the capsule seemed to pierce through me. I knew this wasn't a chance encounter or a detached study. This was the prelude to something much bigger, something terrifying. And I had little time to figure out what it was before it was too late. When the scientist adjusted the screen in front of me, the air in the lab seemed to grow heavier. The video began to play, and the image was grainy, as though it had been filmed decades ago. The footage showed a desolate landscape, a snow-covered desert with a small team in protective suits around smoldering wreckage. It was the crash of what they called Item Alpha. The craft was smaller than I had imagined, with smooth edges and an almost organic metallic sheen. Its sides were crumpled, as if it had entered the atmosphere abruptly. The team worked with surgical precision, removing pieces, analyzing the surroundings, and finally finding what they sought. The body. The being didn't resist. It was motionless, seemingly unconscious, but intact. The capsule that now held it in hibernation was identical to the one shown in the video. The creature was both fascinating and disturbing at first sight, but there was something about the way the team handled it. Almost reverence, yet laced with extreme caution. The initial attempts to interact with the being and its technology were meticulously documented. The screen showed scientists and engineers handling artifacts recovered from the craft. Translucent cylinders that appeared to contain liquid light, reflective surfaces that changed shape when touched. But it was the so-called data core that caught my attention the most. It was a small, black, compact object, pulsing with energy. They had managed to access it years later, and what they found inside was the reason for all the secrecy. The translations, though fragmented, were chillingly clear. Destabilize the dominant species, exploit available resources, establish control. I paused the video, staring at the words on the screen. Each syllable seemed to echo in my mind. The scientist beside me noticed my reaction and, with a tone of almost indifference, said, "That's why you're here, Dr. Hale. To understand what's coming and to help delay the inevitable." I didn't respond. My eyes returned to the screen, which now displayed something even more disturbing. Projections based on the data core. Complex diagrams detailed technologies capable of infiltrating Earth systems. It wasn't just a matter of military force or brutal invasions. They were targeting us where it hurt the most, our social structure itself. Graphs pointed to economic systems, communication networks, and even political dynamics. Their strategies were intricate, focused on exploiting humanity's weaknesses. Small manipulations of financial markets, the spread of misinformation, destabilizing governments from within. They don't need weapons to conquer us, I murmured, more to myself than to the scientist beside me. He simply nodded. We've been seeing signs of this for decades, he continued. The rise of global economic crises, political polarization, ecological collapses that seem self-inflicted. Do you think all of that is just coincidence? My legs felt weak. The pieces were starting to fall into place. Everything I thought were human-made problems, wars, inequality, economic collapses, might have been something far more insidious. But what's the ultimate goal? I asked. The scientist gave me a somber look before answering. Total control. We aren't just resources. We're the environment they want to shape. Our culture, our economy, our biology. All of it is raw material for something greater. We're not the target. We're the means. Suddenly, the full weight of the situation felt like it was crushing my chest. Maybe they weren't coming. Maybe they'd been here all along, pulling the strings, preparing the ground. As I grappled with the enormity of what I'd learned, one final recording began to play. It was what they called direct interaction. It showed a group of scientists attempting to communicate with the being in the capsule in 1991. They had used light signals, mathematical patterns, and even sounds, trying to elicit any response. The creature finally reacted. It wasn't with words or movement, but with a change in the capsule. Its inner surface glowed, forming images the scientists described as visions of the future. They depicted devastated cities, humans working like automatons in controlled environments. The accompanying sound was deafening, a droning, penetrating noise that caused the room's equipment to malfunction. The images ended abruptly, and the capsule's glow faded until the being became inert again. The scientist beside me turned off the screen. "That's what we saw over 30 years ago, Dr. Hale. We know what's coming, but the worst part is that we don't know how to stop it. And this must remain entirely secret." I could barely breathe. I left the lab in silence, my mind reeling from the implications. They were preparing us, shaping us for something beyond our comprehension. As I walked back to my temporary quarters at the facility, one phrase echoed in my mind: destabilize the dominant species. Back at my office at NASA, I felt as though every wall had eyes. The silence was heavy, oppressive, as if the very air carried the tension of what I knew. Something had changed. I had already noticed lingering looks and hushed whispers in the hallways, but now it felt more overt. My passwords were changed without warning, my access to files restricted without explanation. I was being watched. It wasn't paranoia, it was certainty. What kept me on edge, however, wasn't just the sense of surveillance. It was what I was starting to notice in the world around me. In the weeks following my visit to the secret facility, I became obsessed with global news. What used to be background noise, a constant parade of tragedies and crises I, like many others, ignored, now seemed different. Every headline connected to something I had seen in the files and recordings. Armed conflicts were multiplying at an alarming rate. Civil wars were erupting in countries that had once been relatively stable. Environmental disasters were becoming increasingly catastrophic and inexplicable. Reports of droughts in regions that had never faced water shortages and storms hitting areas that had never experienced them before were growing. Even politics seemed more polarized than ever. At first, I tried convincing myself it was all coincidence. The world had always been chaotic. But as I started cross-referencing information, patterns began to emerge. I accessed internal NASA reports, files still within my reach, searching for anything that connected global crises to the alien signals and technologies. It didn't take long to find what I feared. Old documents described anomalies recorded during events that, at the time, were considered natural disasters or political accidents. One file mentioned a communication pattern similar to the signals I discovered, detected moments before the collapse of the Soviet Union. Another described inexplicable fluctuations in Earth's magnetic fields coinciding with the onset of conflicts in the Middle East. Every disaster seemed to be preceded by something invisible, something hiding in plain sight. The worst came when I found a set of documents labeled as Level 5, Presidential Authorization Only. How they were still accessible to me was a mystery, but I suspected someone, somewhere, wanted me to see them. The reports detailed simulations and projections that seemed absurd at first glance. But as I read, I felt the blood drain from my face. The crises weren't accidents. They were orchestrated. The documents described how alien technologies had been used to influence political decisions, manipulate financial markets, and even exacerbate climate disasters. One file detailed minor interventions that triggered cascading effects. For example, a series of electromagnetic pulses in a specific area of the Atlantic's subtly altered ocean currents, leading to devastating hurricanes months later. But it wasn't just the environment being manipulated. It was human society itself. One section described the use of communication networks to spread false information, shape public opinion, and incite hatred between groups. Another document outlined how alien technologies had infiltrated major power security systems, leaving them vulnerable to internal sabotage. Every global crisis was a smokescreen, a carefully orchestrated distraction. While everyone focused on the apparent chaos, something far larger was moving in the shadows. I closed the final document with trembling hands. It was impossible to deny what was in front of me. They didn't need to invade with ships and weapons. They were destroying us from the inside out. My mind returned to the capsule and the images that Item Alpha had projected. It wasn't just a warning. It was a prediction. Humanity was being destabilized, divided, weakened, and the plan was working. But what haunted me more than anything was a question I couldn't answer. What comes next? That night, while I was at home, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment. They were methodical, deliberate, and stopped directly in front of my door. My heart raced. I didn't dare breathe. The silence stretched for several minutes before the footsteps retreated. When I finally had the courage to check, there was no one there. Only a dark envelope lay on the floor, with no name or address. Inside was a single message: "Stop while you still can." I was running out of time. The discovery that aliens were manipulating global events was disturbing enough. But what I was about to uncover would take my fear to another level. I spent days combing through records, cross-referencing data, and using increasingly fragile connections to gather information. My access to NASA's systems was being slowly restricted, and any misstep could draw unwanted attention. But the urgency to understand the scope of the alien plan outweighed my instinct for self-preservation. The documents I found were shocking. Secret meetings between world leaders and mysterious figures. Unregistered conferences at international summits. Seemingly irrational political decisions made shortly after off-agenda meetings. The first clues came from declassified intelligence reports, riddled with technical jargon and redacted to near uselessness. Yet certain terms appeared repeatedly: project interface, a name linked to meetings held in remote locations under heavy security. At first, I thought these were military or economic matters of high importance. Then I stumbled upon a detail that turned my stomach. One meeting, recorded in 2003, had been attended by a figure described as an external consultant, with no name or known affiliation. A note in the report stated that this consultant had demanded all cameras be turned off before entering the room. And it wasn't an isolated incident. Conferences in Geneva, Washington, Moscow, and Beijing displayed similar patterns. Individuals with no official records appeared at critical meetings, often demanding absolute secrecy. Always, the decisions that followed these encounters seemed erratic, even self-destructive, triggering crises that appeared unnecessary. Something far greater was at play. I shifted my focus to finding patterns in the actions of governments and corporations. That's when I realized the true scale of the problem. It wasn't just governments being manipulated, it was the corporations propping them up. Multinational companies controlling infrastructure, technology, and even food production were implicated. Even more disturbing, there seemed to be a direct link between these entities and the alien signals I had studied. One night, while cross-referencing financial records of an energy company with government contracts, I noticed something unusual. Large sums of money were disappearing, allocated to research projects that were never detailed. Curiously, these transactions occurred on dates that coincided with the radio signals NASA had recorded. Following the money trail led me to a European technology corporation. Its directors had public profiles, all meticulously crafted to appear ordinary. But when I dug into birth records, I discovered that two of them had no history prior to 1995. No schools, no jobs, nothing. It was as if they had appeared out of thin air. This discovery reminded me of something I'd seen at the secret facility. A note in the Item Alpha dossier mentioned that its species could adapt to its target's environment, assuming local forms to infiltrate unnoticed. I was right. They were among us. The evidence kept piling up. Decisions that seemed insane, such as economic sanctions that hurt both target and issuer. Geopolitical tensions ignited by trivial incidents. The rise of populist leaders dividing their own people instead of uniting them. All of it was part of a larger plan. These infiltrators were dividing humanity. They didn't need weapons or armies to conquer us. It was enough to sow discord, ignite sparks, and watch us destroy ourselves. The worst came when I found records of a meeting held in 2018. Leaders from 5 nations had gathered with what the documents referred to as external representatives. The report was brief but contained one chilling phrase: transition protocols must be implemented immediately. Resistance will be minimal. Transition. The word echoed in my mind. Transition to what? As each discovery unfolded, the world around me felt increasingly oppressive, as if the walls of reality were closing in. I knew I was getting too close. The anonymous message I'd received days earlier now felt less like a warning and more like a death sentence. After weeks buried in reports and classified files, I thought I had reached the peak of the conspiracy. Governments manipulated, corporations controlled, global crises orchestrated. But then I realized the manipulation extended further, into places I had never thought to look. It started by chance. One sleepless night, I sat on the couch and turned on the TV. A documentary about unexplained phenomena was playing, the kind that oscillates between conspiracy theories and scientific explanations. I wasn't paying much attention until a single phrase made me freeze. What if they're already among us, shaping our beliefs and preparing the ground for inevitable contact? The words were followed by images of old sci-fi movies. Aliens invading, humans resisting. Some scenes were so familiar I wondered why I'd never questioned them before. Acting on instinct rather than certainty, I decided to investigate. I returned to my computer and began researching major Hollywood productions that depicted extraterrestrial contact. It didn't take long to spot a pattern. Movies, music, TV shows, even viral memes, they all seemed to contribute to normalizing the idea of alien life. But not as something to fear. They painted a controlled narrative, as if guiding us to believe that contact wasn't just inevitable, it was benign. A deeper analysis revealed something even more unsettling. Major Hollywood productions often used consulting firms to review scripts. That wasn't unusual. The industry had long worked with military and scientific advisors for authenticity. But as I examined financial reports and partnerships, I found direct ties between some of these consulting firms and companies I knew, through NASA's files, were under alien influence. Certain films contained visual patterns that were difficult to notice on a casual viewing. Repeated symbols, subliminal messages, geometric forms resembling alien structures from the secret facility's archives. But it was in the dialogue that the manipulation became most apparent. Phrases like, "they just want to help us," or "humanity needs an external force to unite," were subtle but incredibly effective. These messages didn't seem random. They shaped the narrative that humans couldn't save themselves and that external intervention was desirable. My stomach turned. I started listening to popular songs more closely. Lyrics repeated similar ideas. Acceptance, resignation, adapting to a new reality. Even rhythms and melodies seemed designed to induce states of calm or euphoria, the exact opposite of what we should feel at the prospect of an imminent invasion. Then came the memes. They seemed harmless, silly jokes on the internet. But there was something strange about them. Many referenced aliens, always presented in a comedic or harmless way. A common phrase circulating online was, "If the aliens come, I hope they take me. I'm done here." It was subtle but devastating. Humanity was being conditioned not to fear the unknown. I gathered everything I had found: film clips, song excerpts, screenshots of memes, analyses of visual patterns. When I finished, I looked at the material on my laptop and realized I was staring at something as insidious as any other aspect of the conspiracy. The media wasn't just distracting us, it was shaping us. As I delved deeper into media manipulation, I realized it wasn't just films, music, and memes shaping public perception. News media played an even darker role. News broadcasts were constant, their flow of information seemingly harmless at first glance. But when I started cross-referencing global events with the patterns I was investigating, I noticed a disturbing trend. Tragedies and crises were exploited to the extreme, but always with the same focus: sensationalism and division. Watching different news channels, it was impossible to ignore how they presented the same events in radically opposing ways. Each network seemed tailored to a specific audience, pushing narratives that fueled fear, hatred, and mutual distrust. Peaceful protests were portrayed as violent acts on one channel and as heroic on another. Environmental disasters were framed alternately as divine punishment or political manipulation. Every headline seemed designed to inflame emotions and deepen divisions among people. The more I analyzed, the more I found patterns in the themes of the news. Localized tragedies presented with global intensity to keep everyone in a constant state of alert. Stories about corruption that focused on minor figures, diverting attention from deeper issues. manufactured scandals that dominated the news cycle only to disappear days later, as if they'd never existed. I realized then that this wasn't just about distraction but psychological control. The media was a machine feeding anger and fear, dividing people into opposing camps. This polarization had a purpose. While people fought over politics, religion, and morality, no one looked at the bigger picture. No one questioned the causes of events. And most importantly, no one realized they were being manipulated. There was something even more sinister behind this. As I reviewed NASA's databases, I discovered a worrying detail. Several major communication networks were directly linked to the same corporations controlling the alien artifacts. It wasn't a coincidence. They didn't just want to distract us. They wanted to divide us. With a population constantly at war with itself, humanity's natural defenses were weakened. The real enemy could operate unnoticed. Meanwhile, the news cycle continued. More headlines about violence, more tragedies, more fabricated stories that kept us trapped in chaos. I turned off the TV that night, but the sound of the headlines lingered in my head. They weren't just words, they were weapons. Then my phone rang, cutting through the silence of the room. I answered hesitantly, not looking at the number. A low, urgent female voice spoke on the other end. "Dr. Hale, they're listening. Stop now." Before I could respond, the call ended. Suddenly, the weight of what I was facing hit me. It wasn't just governments or corporations. It was the entire structure of society, manipulated like a puppet show. And the audience was applauding, unaware the performance was the prelude to its own destruction. Returning to the secret desert facility was a risky decision. After everything I had uncovered, I knew my presence there wouldn't go unnoticed for long. But my former colleague, Alan Royce, had managed something few could: access to the deepest levels of the facility. Oh, I didn't mention before, but he was the one who helped me get in the first time. Alan was an astrophysicist like me, but his career had led him to work on classified projects at the facility since the early 2000s. When I contacted him, careful not to raise suspicion, he was direct. "You're not wrong, Nathan. But what you know is just the surface. If you want to understand what we're facing, you need to see what's below." The trip was discreet. Alan used his credentials to sneak me in as a technical consultant on a fictitious project. Security was tighter than the last time, but Alan seemed to know the blind spots. We reached what he called Level 0. Unlike the laboratories I'd seen before, this sector was more raw, with exposed concrete walls and dim lighting. This was where the oldest and most confidential records were stored. At the center of the archive, Alan opened a terminal and typed in a sequence of codes that seemed endless. A massive screen lit up, and records began to appear. "These reports were never meant to be written," he said. "But some of us can't accept letting the truth die in silence." The first document was a 1965 report describing what appeared to be the first documented contact with alien technology. Not a whole spacecraft, but fragments recovered in an aerial incident. These fragments were analyzed and, according to the report, demonstrated properties beyond human understanding. I discovered these materials had been used to develop technologies we now consider essential: communication networks, satellites, even microchips. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. Another file, dated 1981, detailed the use of alien technology to simulate natural phenomena. Early tests included manipulating weather patterns and seismic waves. Unexplainable phenomena like earthquakes in unusual areas or sudden climate changes had been experiments, disguised as natural events. Alan opened another, more recent document. It contained detailed graphs showing the impact of global pandemics on social cohesion. "They know exactly how much we can take before we start turning on each other," Alan said, his voice tense. The records indicated that pandemics, while often of natural origin, were amplified by small alien interventions. Alterations to viruses, accelerated mutations. It wasn't necessary to create a biological agent from scratch. It was enough to manipulate what already existed. The goal, as always, wasn't total destruction but destabilization. Distrust, fear, isolation, every ingredient necessary to weaken a civilization from within. They don't need to destroy us directly, Nathan, Alan continued. They're breaking us apart piece by piece, and we're helping them do it. One final report caught my attention. It was older, dated 1947, and bore a name I immediately recognized: Roswell. What happened there wasn't a simple crash. It was the first of many covered-up encounters. But the most important detail was that the crash wasn't an accident. The documents suggested the craft had been deliberately sacrificed. A bait. Why? I asked. To give us just enough technology to start playing with things we don't understand. Suddenly, everything made sense. The wars, the disasters, the global crises, they weren't just alien interventions. They were reflections of our own arrogance, manipulated by an intelligence that knew exactly how to weaponize our ambition against us. Alan looked me in the eye. We're fighting something that not only surpasses us in technology but also in patience. They've waited decades, maybe centuries, to reach this point, and now we're exactly where they want us. At that moment, I realized what we were truly up against. It wasn't just an imminent invasion. It was a long game, meticulously planned with relentless precision. And time was running out. My only chance was to expose everything I knew, but with every attempt, it felt like I was making a fatal mistake. I started reaching out to independent channels, journalists outside the mainstream, those who prided themselves on revealing the truth at any cost. Yet every time I sent a message or shared a file, something happened. The emails didn't go through. The calls dropped before they connected. And when I finally managed to speak to a trusted contact, the conversation was interrupted by interference, followed by a heavy silence. When I tried calling again, the number was out of service. I went to check the files I had sent. They were gone, wiped clean so thoroughly that even my encrypted backups were obliterated. I didn't need more signs. They were watching me. It was during one of these desperate attempts to escape and expose the truth that the inevitable happened. I was at an abandoned train station, using a laptop connected to a public network to send the last files I'd managed to recover. The place was deserted, except for a man in a suit who seemed too out of place to ignore. He approached me, unarmed, unhurried, but with an expression that mixed exhaustion and something resembling pity. "Dr. Hale," he said, his tone almost friendly. "You can't win this." I stood, ready to run, but he raised a hand, gesturing for me to stay where I was. "I know what you found," he continued calmly, "and I know what you're trying to do, but it's too late." His tone was strange, as if he genuinely believed what he was saying. "Who are you?" I asked. He simply smiled. "I'm someone who understands things as they really are. Do you think you'll change anything by shouting your discoveries to the world? Do you think they'll believe you?" "I have proof," I retorted, trying to maintain my composure. "Proof that can disappear, like everything you've sent, like all the contacts you've tried to make." That sentence froze me. He knew. "Why are you telling me this?" He sighed, tilting his head. "Because it doesn't matter anymore. You're just another piece on the board. And while you try to save the game, they're already making the next move. That's how it works." Before I could respond, he turned and began to walk away. "Wait!" I shouted. "Why all this? What's their plan?" Without turning back, he said only one thing: "To keep you busy while everything you know collapses." Then he disappeared into the darkness. Adrenaline coursed through my veins as I sped down the deserted road. In the trunk of the car was an alien device I had stolen during my last visit to the facility. It seemed to radiate an invisible weight. I didn't know what it could actually do, but the files contained within it were clear enough. This was the core of their infiltration operations. Records of meetings with global leaders, crisis manipulation, blueprints of Earth's defense systems, it was all there. But what disturbed me most was the countdown embedded in the device, marked by a symbol I immediately recognized: the pattern from the alien signals. The final date was less than a month away. It was like an invisible hourglass counting down the last days of humanity as we knew it. I couldn't go home, and I knew the roads were being watched. They were after me, and what awaited wasn't just imprisonment. Every shadow along the road seemed to hide something. Every passing vehicle made me grip the wheel tighter. It was on a back road, far from the main routes, that I saw them for the first time. Two black SUVs appeared in the rearview mirror, approaching far too quickly to be a coincidence. I slammed on the accelerator, trying to put distance between us, but they didn't back off. A closer look in the mirror revealed something even more terrifying. The drivers weren't just ordinary humans. Their movements were too precise, their faces expressionless, like puppets following unseen commands. Hybrids, they accelerated, forcing me off the road and into an open field. I managed to lose them for a few minutes, but soon I found myself cornered. I jumped out of the car, clutching the device as tightly as I could, and ran toward a wooded area. The sound of footsteps behind me was methodical, relentless. They didn't shout, didn't communicate. They just followed. As I ran, I realized the true attack wouldn't be an invasion. There wouldn't be ships descending in flames or battles in the skies. They didn't need that. We were already being defeated, controlled from within. But now I knew the exact timing. Before Christmas, when humanity would be distracted, divided, vulnerable. If I couldn't expose this before then, it would be the end. The footsteps grew closer, echoing through the trees as I weaved through the darkness. The shadows danced under the pale moonlight, and every movement I made seemed amplified by the silence of the field. I clutched the alien device so tightly that its sharp edges nearly cut into my hand. My pursuers didn't shout or make unnecessary noise. They were precise, calculated, moving as if they were an extension of the night itself. But I knew them well enough by now to understand that, while efficient, they weren't perfect. I made a sharp turn, veering toward a small creek, and followed the water to mask my tracks. The biting cold stung my feet, but I didn't stop. I kept moving, stumbling over rocks and branches until the forest began to thin out. That's when I saw what looked like shelter. A small concrete structure, weathered with time, partially buried in the side of a hill. It looked like an old bunker or maybe an abandoned surveillance station. I didn't think twice. I shoved the rusted door with all my strength and slipped inside, the smell of mildew and rust filling the air. I locked the door behind me, jamming a rusty metal bar across it as an improvised brace, and slid to the ground, trying to catch my breath. The footsteps outside slowed but didn't fade entirely. They were close, searching. It was only a matter of time before they found me. I needed to act fast. The bunker was nearly empty except for a table and a chair in the corner. I placed the alien device on the table and opened my disposable laptop, the last one I'd managed to hold onto after days of running and relentless pursuit. There was no room for doubt or hesitation. If they found me, it would all end here. But if I could just finish what I'd started, maybe there was a chance someone would uncover the truth. I powered on the laptop and began to write. My hands were shaking, but I couldn't stop. Every word had to be precise, clear, direct. There was no time for rewrites or second thoughts. The world needed to know what was happening, even if it meant I wouldn't make it out of this place alive. As I typed, I felt a low hum, almost imperceptible, vibrating through the floor. They were close again. The air in the bunker seemed heavier, charged with static electricity. I kept going. If you are reading this, I typed, it means there's a chance, however small, that humanity can still fight back. Time was running out, and the signs were clear. Blackouts in major cities, communication failures, the mysterious lights in the sky. They weren't hiding anymore. I kept writing until the laptop's battery indicator began to flash, threatening to shut everything down. I connected the alien device to the laptop, hoping its residual energy could power the system. It worked. The screen lit up again, and I kept typing. Every word felt like a battle against time, against the growing fear that the rusted door would give way before I could finish. When I was done, I prepared to send it everywhere I could. Social media, obscure forums, old contacts. I didn't know if any of it would reach its destination, but I had to try. The hum outside grew louder. Footsteps approached the door, slow and methodical. They were here, and I knew I wasn't leaving this shelter alive. But at least, with luck, my message might. My name is Dr. Nathan Hale. If you're reading this, it means time is almost up. Everything you've seen, everything you've learned in this account, was my desperate attempt to warn the world. I don't know where I am now, or even if I'm still alive. They're hunting me, and I don't think I have much time left. They are here. They are in control. The wars, the crises, the disasters we faced in recent years were not accidents. None of it was by chance. It was all orchestrated to divide us, to distract us. While we fought among ourselves, they consolidated their power. You cannot trust the governments, the media, or the institutions that were supposed to protect you. They have already been infiltrated, turned into tools to keep you compliant and misinformed. The final attack is near. They will use the chaos they've created as a smokescreen to seize total control. If you're reading this, please share it. Spread it. Tell everyone. I don't know if what I've left here will be enough, but it's all I can do. Time is running out.